On the 25th of August 2017, at the Great Dorset Steam Fair, a steamroller drove over and crushed a computer hard drive. It took a few attempts, a bit of back and forth, but in the end it was completely destroyed. The drive contained at least 10 unfinished novels by fantasy author Terry Pratchett, who died 2 years previously. And the destruction of those books was done exactly according to his final wishes.
Well, before his death, Terry stated that he wanted his unfinished work and his hard drive to be run over by a steamroller. And I suppose it's finally happened, I guess. A 6.5-ton steamroller called Lord Jericho, that's owned by the organiser of the Steam Fair, ran over the hard drive a few times. It completely annihilated the stone blocks underneath, but the hard drive survived better than we expected, so we then also put it in a stone crusher as well afterwards.
So let's just say that Pratchett's weirdly specific instructions for the destruction of his hard drive were not that easy to follow. Hence why it took 2 years and a trip to Dorset. Apparently he wanted his hard drive either steamrolled over or fired into space, and the former option seemed a little more feasible. The point is, 10 potential novels will now never be published, because Pratchett knew exactly what happens to manuscripts when the author is no longer there to look after them. Hello and welcome to Spincer's Library. I'm Claudia, and today I want to talk about the death of the author. No, not that. I mean, I want to talk about authors who died literally, not figuratively. You know what I'm talking about. You read the title of this video. No need to play coy now. The reaction of Terry Pratchett's fans to the news that there was now no chance of more Discworld novels being published posthumously was mixed, though most seemed to understand his reasons. Pratchett was clearly very protective of his writing. He didn't want anything published without his full control over it, even after his death. He was also in the unusual position of knowing that there would be unfinished manuscripts left behind. 8 years passed between his diagnosis of early onset Alzheimer's disease and his death at 66.
Are you afraid of death?
No.
He's a rather likeable character in your books.
Yes, he owes me a lot of money.
He's made you a lot of money.
Who can be afraid of death? What's there to be afraid of?
And in those years, he wrote and published 4 more Discworld novels. He never stopped writing. When he got too ill to type, he started dictating his books. It's not surprising that he wanted full control over them after his death. Though maybe to some, this seems like a weird thing to care about. A strange request to want them destroyed in such a physical and final way. He must have known that his fans and the wider reading public would have absolutely lapped up those fragmented novels, those unfinished drafts. Yet he didn't want us to see them. And I get it. I recently read the novel Web by John Wyndham, which was published in 1979, 10 years after the author's death. I didn't realize that fact when I picked it up, because I'm exactly the sort of reader who does no research at all before choosing a book. It was disappointing. At this point, I'd read 5 of John Wyndham's novels and enjoyed them all, so when Web turned out to be a bit crap, I was confused. The premise of the novel sounds like classic Wyndham. It's about a project launched by a self-important millionaire who buys up a deserted island in the Pacific and sends a few dozen volunteers there in an attempt to create a new utopian society. Then everyone gets eaten by mutant spiders. Sounds fun, right? Okay, sounds fun if you're into that sort of thing, which I am. We don't kink shame here. But the book was so badly paced, with the first half being entirely made up of the most mind-numbing info dumps on backstory, that when we finally get to the fun spiders eating people bits, it was quite rushed and anticlimactic. There were some interesting characters that never really got the chance to shine on the page. The whole thing just seemed unfinished, like a first draft for the author's eyes only. Then I saw that this was, in fact, not published during Wyndham's lifetime, and it all made sense. Obviously, a posthumously published novel was never going to be quite good enough. It's more likely than not a money grab by the publisher, or the author's estate, or someone who values money over quality, right? Maybe we should just never publish anything posthumously. Clearly, there's something not quite right about that. Then I realized that I'm a massive hypocrite because not 1, not 2, but 3 of my all-time favorite novels were, in fact, published after their authors' deaths. So at least in those cases, the end result was worth it? For me, an entirely subjective reader, what's the issue with posthumous publishing? It's not a simple question to answer, hence what looks like it might just turn out to be a 30-minute video on the matter. There are nuances on the dead author dodginess scale. From, whoops, forgot to put a stamp on it, here you go, Mr. Penguin Random House, on one end of the scale, to scraping the bottom of the barrel for 3 discarded sentences to string together and call a novel at the other. There's cases of following the author's wishes to a T. There's cases of blatant money grabbing, and everything in between. Sometimes posthumous publishing is, contradictory to the title of this video, entirely unproblematic. Terry Pratchett, for example, who had his unfinished novels quite literally steamrolled over for fear of having them released into the world, didn't live to see his very final Discworld book, The Shepherd's Crown, published. It came out in August 2015, 5 months after his death. It's obvious that this novel was intended for publication, that it was, for all intents and purposes, finished. It was not one of the 10 books on the hard drive. And still, according to Pratchett's friend and fellow author Neil Gaiman, there was a final scene that Pratchett had intended to write, but then got too ill to put his idea into words. Rob Wilkins, Pratchett's assistant and later manager of his literary estate, that's the guy who organized the steamroller, by the way, he too said that there was more that Pratchett had planned to do with the book. So even this case isn't as cut and dry as it might first appear. Still, it's obvious that The Shepherd's Crown is meant to be the final Discworld novel, that it was meant for publication, and that Terry Pratchett worked hard to complete it before his death. On the dodginess scale, this is pretty far over to the left. Terry Pratchett wasn't the first author to ask for his unfinished works to be demolished, not by far. So let's go back to the beginning of the 20th century and have a look at this man and this book. The Trial is one of Franz Kafka's most well-known works, a bizarre and harrowing novel about a protagonist who suddenly finds himself at the center of a criminal trial without quite knowing how he got there. It's quintessential Kafka. And yet, it was published in 1925, the year after the author's death. The novel was strung together by Kafka's friend Max Brod, who edited over 100 loose pages of manuscript, without even being entirely sure in which order the chapters were supposed to be. Safe to say that what we now know as The Trial might not even be close to how Kafka intended it to be published. And in the decades since its first edition, several other editors and critics have put together new editions with different chapter orders and different material included. The question of what exactly the intended version of The Trial is continuously being argued by academics. The thing is, Kafka never intended The Trial to be published at all. When he appointed Max Brod as the administrator of his estate, he quite literally told him to burn all his unpublished works after his death. And we have, as they say, got the receipts. Here's my own translation of these letters. If you're curious, you'll find the originals and any other sources I'm citing or referencing linked in the description box. Anyway, this is what Kafka wrote to Brod. Dearest Max, my final request. Anything that makes up my estate, diaries, manuscripts, letters, my own and by others, drawings, etc., is to be burned unread in its entirety. Seems like a pretty clear instruction to me. In a separate letter to Max Brod, Kafka also specifies which of his works he considers to count as his. He essentially lists his own canon. The Trial is not among those works. Again, he repeats his plea. All my other writing is to be burned, preferably unread. Though I wouldn't judge you for looking, I'd prefer if you didn't, but no one else must read it. I beg you to burn it completely and as soon as possible. According to Brod, he told Kafka at the time that he wouldn't do that, and Kafka still entrusted his estate to him, so that's his justification for going against his wishes. Whatever helps you sleep at night, Max. Either way, instead of following his friend's wishes and either burning The Trial and other unfinished works, Max Brod published them, then gifted the original manuscripts to his girlfriend, who would later sell them to the German National Library for £1 million. In a paper from 2011 with the title Who Owns Kafka?, Judith Butler talks about the implication of how his estate was handled. And this is what they say.
But it was not just the specters of technology that would eagerly feed upon his work, but those forms of profit-making that exploit even the most anti-instrumental forms of art, and those forms of nationalism that seek to appropriate those modes of writing that most rigorously resist them. An irony, then, to be sure, that Kafka's writings finally became someone else's stuff, packed into a closet or a vault, transmogrified into exchange value, waiting for his afterlife as an icon of national belonging, or quite simply, as money.
This really is an excellent paper, and Butler makes so many fascinating points. You can find the whole thing linked down below if you want to listen to the rest. Kafka made his intentions very clear with absolutely no room for speculation. His wishes were still ignored, disrespected. If Max Brod had followed the instructions he was given and burned all of those manuscripts, there is no doubt that Kafka would not be the household name he is today. His place in what we call the Western canon, which is obviously a flawed concept in of itself, has been cemented by those posthumous publications, including The Trial. I have a feeling that Max Brod was not motivated by greed, but rather by a desire to see his friend's work out in the world, to see it read and talked about even after his early death. But does that justify what he did? Does that make it okay? If we're adding The Trial to the dodginess scale, I'm afraid it's got to go all the way over here. So I mentioned earlier that some of my all-time favorite books are part of the posthumous publishing club. And two of those were written by Jane Austen, Northanger Abbey and Persuasion. Northanger Abbey is generally considered Jane Austen's first finished novel and Persuasion her last. But both were actually published together in December 1817, 6 months after her death. This is something I'd never really thought about much before. Who had those books published? Why those two? We know Jane Austen left behind other manuscripts, such as the epistolary novella Lady Susan or the unfinished novel Sanditon. How did Northanger Abbey and Persuasion end up as the final two pieces of what we now consider the Jane Austen opus? Did she even want those books published, or do we have another Kafka situation on our hands? In March 1817, Austen wrote this in a letter to her niece Fanny. Miss Catherine is put upon the shelf for the present, and I do not know that she will ever come out. But I have a something ready for publication, which may perhaps appear about a 12-month hence. It is short, about the length of Catherine. This is for yourself alone. I imagine at this point she gave a cheeky little wink. In this snippet, Jane Austen tells us something about both of her posthumously published novels, though not being clairvoyant, she didn't know it at the time. Catherine was the working title for the novel that was, less than a year later, to be published as Northanger Abbey. Though at the time of this letter to her niece, Jane Austen evidently had no plans of publishing it. But the other book that she mentioned, the something ready for publication, that's the novel that turned out to be Persuasion. Austen didn't want Fanny to tell anyone about it yet, but it sounds to me like at the time she wrote that letter, Persuasion was ready to be printed. Of course, Austen would never see its publication because she died before the 12-month was up. So then what happened with Persuasion? And how did Catherine, the novel Austen had shelved in 1817, become published as Northanger Abbey? The answer to both of those questions is Jane's brother Henry. During her lifetime, he was a close confidant, one of the people she trusted with her writing, proofreading it, helping her with various contracts with publishers, etc. In 1803, years before the publication of any of her novels, Austen sold the manuscript for Northanger Abbey to a London publishing house under the working title Susan. The publisher never printed it, but held on to it, despite Jane Austen's attempts to reclaim the book. Only in 1816 did Henry Austen manage to buy it back from the publisher, and Jane continued to work on it, changing the title from Susan to Catherine, because there were in fact only 17 English girls' names at the time, and Austen used all of them in Pride and Prejudice. By March 1817, however, she'd put Catherine aside, as the letter from earlier shows. Still, her brother ended up publishing it months after her death. He also changed the title of the book to Northanger Abbey, which kind of explains a lot. Most of the book isn't actually set at Northanger Abbey. It only really features in the second half of the story. If Jane Austen had survived long enough to have this published herself, we might now be talking about Catherine instead, or Susan, or whichever girl's name Jane Austen liked the sound of at the time. So where does this go on the dodginess scale? On the one hand, Jane Austen considered it shelved in 1817. But on the other, she had previously tried and failed to publish it. As far as we know, her brother didn't change any significant part of the story other than the title. I'd say we can safely put it about here. I'm sorry I've not been scratching your chin sufficiently. Persuasion, as we already heard earlier, was intended for publication, though once again it was Henry who gave it its final title. We don't actually know what Jane Austen was going to call the novel. I think this one can safely go here on the dodginess scale. Another fun fact about the posthumous publication of those two novels is that this was the first time that Jane Austen's name was printed on one of her books. Before then, during her lifetime, her novels were published anonymously, as was not uncommon for female authors of the time. But this combined edition of Northanger Abbey and Persuasion contained a biographical notice, which was likely written by Henry Austen, possibly in collaboration with his sister Cassandra. It's essentially an obituary of Jane, heartfelt and loving, introducing her to the world as an author of great talent and character. She never uttered either a hasty, a silly, or a severe expression. In short, her temper was as polished as her wit, nor were her manners inferior to her temper. They were of the happiest kind. No one could be often in her company without feeling a strong desire of obtaining her friendship and cherishing a hope of having obtained it. She was tranquil without reserve or stiffness, and communicative without intrusion or self-sufficiency. She became an authoress entirely from taste and inclination. Neither the hope of fame nor profit mixed with her early motives. Few so gifted were so truly unpretending. Henry clearly wanted his sister's legacy to last and to be connected to her name. He set the foundation that would make Jane Austen into the beloved author she has since become. Jane Austen had the disadvantage of writing novels as a single woman 2 centuries ago. It was only possible for her to pursue her craft because she did it anonymously, and because she had the backing and support of her family, of Henry in particular, as her representative in dealing with publishers. Remember that Northanger Abbey was sold back to him at his inquiries, after being refused to Jane years previously, and her threat of legal action was not taken seriously. Both Northanger Abbey and Persuasion would have been published at the beginning and end of Jane Austen's writing career had it been up to her. Of that I am certain. Another author whose posthumous publication was necessitated by the circumstances of the time in which it was written was E.M. Forster. His life as a novelist was somewhat atypical because even though he lived to the age of 91, he wrote most of his novels as a young man in the first decade of the 20th century. His final novel, A Passage to India, was published when he was only 45 in 1924. The 5 books he'd published by that time certainly made an impact, leading, among other accolades, to 22 separate nominations for the Literature Nobel Prize. Forster spent the second half of his life writing short stories, plays, and essays. His novel writing days were over. However, there was one novel that didn't see the light of day during his lifetime. Maurice was written just before the First World War, many decades before Forster's death, but it remained unpublished until 1971. Unlike his other 5 novels, this one focuses on a romance between men, with the usual commentary on class and wealth in society that marks his other work as well. It's Forster's most directly romantic book, where the love story is right at the center of the plot and the theme of sexuality is more overt than in any of his others. It's also his most melancholy work. Male homosexuality wasn't decriminalized in England and Wales until 1967. That's over 50 years after Maurice was written. Publishing it before then, if at all possible, would have been risky and dangerous in a very real way. Forster held on to Maurice for decades, revising it periodically, showing it to his closest and most trusted friends. In 1957, he made allusions to it in an interview with Wilfred Stone. Stone had heard rumours of an unpublished Forster novel and asked about it. Does such a novel exist? At this, his face clouded a little. He seemed a bit resentful and wondered where I had received the information, but did not press me for an answer. Yes, I have such a novel. In 1960, Forster added a note to Maurice that read, Publishable, but worth it? I think he answered the question for himself. Forster lived and worked in a time that saw many of his contemporaries in the crossfire of English public morality, subjected to censorship and obscenity trials. Forster had, by this point, cemented himself as one of the most notable British authors of the 20th century. He had built a reputation, and it's not surprising that he wasn't willing to risk that. And so Morris remained hidden. Forster didn't keep his sexuality a secret, not in his close circles where his relationships were well known. There was even a mention in a half-hour obituary program that was broadcast on the BBC a month after his death.
I think that in his early period of creation, he felt himself, because of his own sexual tastes and beliefs, a very isolated, in some ways threatened person. At the time of a passage to India, he moves into a circle of friends, of like-minded human beings, profoundly in sympathy with him. And it's at least conceivable that something of the spur of anxiety, the spur of mutiny against his background begins being less important at that time. He wouldn't be the first very important human being for whom finding happiness is not the best medium for art.
But can you see that the strain of being a homosexual at a time when it was taboo to mention it is visible in the subjects and treatment of the early novels?
Oh, I think very much so, but I would want to put it a little more generally. The strain of being a human being with a code of beliefs and personal behavior of the highest dignity and sensitivity, and not being able to live that openly in any way.
When Morris was finally published the very next year, it was awaited by trepidation by the reading public. From the press, it received mixed reviews. According to a 2021 article by Peter Parker, no, not that one, the book was dismissed for, among other things, its happy ending, which was considered fairy tale-like and implausible. Parker continues to say that Morris, despite its occasional absurdities, now seems worthy of him in a way most critics were reluctant to acknowledge half a century ago. He places the book in the context of queer classic literature and suggests that Morris would undoubtedly have made a more significant contribution to the recording of that history had Forster published it during his lifetime. As far as I can see, that was simply not a possibility. Apart from the fact that publishers would likely have rejected the manuscript outright, in the legal, societal, and political climate of the time, it would have absolutely killed Forster's career and perhaps even risked his freedom. Among the books I've talked about in this video, Morris is the one where the gap between its creation and its publication is the biggest. It reads like what it is, a book written before the First World War, which is so at odds with its 1971 publication date. And yet, there's nothing dodgy about the posthumous publication of this particular work. I personally think it's one of Forster's most accomplished novels. For me, it's on par with his much more well-known Howard's End. It doesn't read like a draft, like something half-finished and forgotten. It doesn't read like it's been dug up by some money-hungry editor and sellotaped together from fragments found under the author's desk in a bin. It's a complete work, it's a great novel, and it's a perfect example of the phrase ahead of its time. This brings me back to John Wyndham, which, as much as it pains me to say, does read like a first draft rather than a finished novel. You remember, that's the one about the man eating spiders. Unlike other books I've talked about so far, which were published months after their author's deaths, this one sat around unpublished for 10 years after John Wyndham died before it was finally published. Why is that? Was the manuscript hidden away in a secret desk drawer and only found due to a combination of good luck and an extremely nosy 10-year-old armed with a hairpin? Or was it put away in a box with the words, "Cursed, open at your own peril," written on it in blood? I don't know, because annoyingly, I've been able to find out very little about the creation of Webb. Someone on the internet claims that the manuscript had been rejected by Wyndham's publisher when he'd sent it in the 60s, and that it was resubmitted by his estate in the late 70s. But even if that's true, I have no idea what happened in between. Why the 10-year wait? How much had Wyndham's manuscript been edited before it was published? Not enough, in my opinion. And had Wyndham lived longer, would he have reworked this draft into a full-length novel of intrigue exquisite world building and fascinating characters like his other books? Or would it simply have remained a draft, an unfinished idea started but ultimately discarded? We'll never know. I'm getting dodgy vibes off this, which I admit is not exactly a scientific measure. Still, on the scale, I'm going to put it here. Really, this example sums up my feelings about posthumous publishing in general. Each case of it is unique and complex, and the publication history so obscure sometimes that it makes it hard for us to judge what really happened. There's no simple answer. In some cases, like Wyndham's, I truly believe that the main motivation is financial. In others, like Kafka's and Austen's, I get the feeling that the people responsible for the publication of those posthumous works did it out of a desire to see a beloved author's legacy established. There are so many authors I didn't get the chance to talk about in this video, like Jules Verne, whose adventure novels made such an impact during his lifetime that after his death, his son Michel began to publish sequels under his father's name, stitched together from various half-finished manuscripts, but mostly written by him. Or The Professor by Charlotte Bronte, which was completed, edited and published by her widower Arthur Bell Nichols, despite probably being an early draft of her novel Villette. I didn't even know Charlotte Bronte was married. Ian Fleming's children's book Chitty Chitty Bang Bang was inspired by stories he told his son, but Fleming died just months before it was published. The more I researched posthumous publishing for this video, the more I realized that each case of it truly is unique, and the ethics involved are complex and far beyond me to answer unambiguously. Does intent matter when it comes to posthumous publishing? In the case of all of these works, why were they not published during the author's lifetime? In the case of Persuasion, the author died before she could send the manuscript to a publisher. In the case of Morris, the author didn't want to risk his freedom and reputation at a time where the subject matter of the book might have gotten him in prison. In the case of Terry Pratchett's flattened hard drive, he knew exactly that he did not want his unfinished works to ever see the light of day without his input. There are some aspects of posthumous publishing that I didn't touch on in this video, such as the legalities of copyright in various countries. There are also cases like that of Harper Lee's controversial second novel Go Set a Watchman, which was published during the author's lifetime, only just, but would truly blow the limits of the dodginess scale. It would also blow the boundaries of this video, but if you don't remember the controversy around intent and consent that happened at the time, do look it up. Generally, if you're interested in the subject matter, do have a little browse of the links in the description box for further reading. In the end, an author's legacy lives much longer than the author themselves. Sometimes that legacy is carried by works that, for one reason or another, were only published after the author's death. The dodginess scale only gets us so far. Each of these books has a story, and sometimes that story is as complex as the novel itself. Thank you for watching. Bye!